She inherited a $25.6 million business and hid it from her fiancé until the day after the wedding. I was 32 when the world I'd carefully built, efficient, quiet, and impressively boring, was quietly shattered by a single letter delivered not by a courier, but by the same lawyer who once held my hand at my grandfather's funeral. Samantha Miller, financier by profession, daughter of public school teachers by origin, wife to Jason by choice and habit. Most people thought of me as practical, even dull. My suits were gray, my life was structured, my smile perfectly inoffensive. They didn't know what I knew. They didn't know about Harlow Technologies. My grandfather, Richard Miller, was a titan disguised as a gentleman with a stubborn chin and eyes that had seen too much. He built Harlow Technologies in 1975 from his garage, coaxing wires and circuits into what would become one of the most quietly powerful data security companies in the country. By the time I was old enough to understand numbers, he had already drilled 2 rules into me so deep they etched themselves into my bones. Trust, but verify, and never let them know what you hold. When he passed, he left me something much heavier than grief. A folder, a whisper, and then, in time, the company itself. Not in my name, of course. That would have been too loud, too visible. The transfer came through an intricate maze of trusts and proxies. Barely anyone knew I was the controlling shareholder. Not even Jason. Jason, my husband, is a good man. Earnest. Loves dogs. Always overcooks pasta. Talks to his plants like they're co-workers. He sees me as successful, sure, but in a respectable, client meeting on Zoom kind of way. He knows I'm cautious with money, likes that about me. He doesn't know that our cozy condo was paid for in full, that my modest car is parked next to a Ferrari I technically own but have never driven. He doesn't know about the floor-to-ceiling server room I built under a false name. And I hope he never will. It's not that I don't love him. I do. But love doesn't erase the training my grandfather gave me. It doesn't erase the faces of men I've seen crumble because they were too trusting, too soft. And while Jason slept soundly next to me each night, I stayed up reading shareholder reports and encrypted memos. He thinks I worry about taxes. I worry about boardroom coups. I wear thrift store cardigans to meetings and take Uber Pool when I have to travel for work. I carry a debit card that looks worn even though the account behind it could buy a house in cash. To everyone I know, I'm just a well-off woman with a good job. To the 3 lawyers who know the truth, I'm the sole heir to an empire built on silent contracts and unbreakable encryption. There are days it weighs on me, this double life. Like when Jason wanted to renovate our kitchen and I told him we couldn't afford it, even though I had just approved a budget of $2 million for Harlow's next expansion. Or when he suggested starting a family, and I quietly panicked, wondering how I'd ever explain the encrypted safe behind my bookshelves to a curious child. But then I think of my grandfather's eyes, the quiet steel in them, and I remember why I do this. Why I protect the secret. Not out of greed, not out of paranoia, but because power is safest when it's invisible. And Harlow Technologies, with its $25 million valuation and its web of silent influence, is a secret I've kept better than I've kept anything else in my life. So I make coffee. I attend PDA meetings for a child we don't yet have. I keep my passwords memorized, my investments cloaked, and my heart steady. This is my life. This is my secret. And every time I smile at Jason across our modest dinner table, I thank my grandfather silently for teaching me to hide in plain sight. It started at one of those charity events where the wine is too warm, the conversation too rehearsed, and everyone pretends to care more than they do. I was there for optics, networking, shaking hands, exchanging meaningless business cards while smiling through clenched teeth. Jason was standing near the silent auction table, studying a signed basketball like it held the secrets of the universe. His tie was slightly crooked, his shoes clean but not polished, and he had this unguarded way of smiling, like he hadn't learned yet how the world really worked. Or maybe he had, and just chose not to care. We met over burnt bruschetta and a shared distaste for the speaker's forced humor. He told me he was a teacher, 8th grade English, public school, 23 students, 1 broken smartboard. He said it all like it was enough, like it meant something. I like that. It felt honest in a way that finance never did. Jason didn't know who I was, didn't recognize my name, didn't care about my blazer or what hedge fund I worked for. He asked what books I liked and told me how his students refused to read anything older than 2015 unless there were zombies involved. I laughed more that night than I had in months. It felt dangerous. We started seeing each other. Quiet dinners, walks through the city, weekends spent reading in his apartment that smelled like vanilla and old textbooks. He cooked spaghetti with too much garlic and let me beat him at Scrabble even though he was clearly better. He made me forget about share prices and encryption protocols and reminded me that not every decision had to be dissected for risk. But then I met his mother, Eleanor. She showed up on a Sunday with a tray of lemon bars and questions wrapped in syrup. At first, she seemed charming in that overbearing suburban way. Pearls too tight around her throat, perfume heavy like regret, smile wide, but never reaching her eyes. She told stories about Jason's childhood with a tone that dared anyone to interrupt. She called me dear and leaned in too close when she spoke. The first thing she asked me was where I went to school. The second was what I did for a living. The third, how much I made. I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. She folded her hands over her lap and stared at me with the kind of calm that only comes from decades of manipulation. Said things like, "My Jason is so generous, sometimes too generous. It's hard for a good man to get ahead these days, don't you think?" Then she'd follow it with, "Not all women are intimidated by a man with modest means. I admire that about you." It wasn't subtle. Eleanor never was. She asked about my apartment. If I owned it. What neighborhood? What floor? Whether the building had security. She smiled when I said yes to all of it. Then asked if Jason had ever mentioned his student loans. I said no. Her smile widened. Over the next few weeks, Jason and I kept falling into each other, soft and fast, and without enough questions. But I started noticing the patterns. How he'd suddenly cancel plans because his mom needed help installing a light fixture. How he'd pause before answering if she called. How he never made a decision, big or small, without checking in with her first. When I asked if he wanted to take a weekend trip together, he hesitated, said he'd have to see what his mom thought. I told myself it was harmless. I lied. Eleanor began calling me directly, just to check in. She once asked if I had a 5-year plan. When I gave a vague answer, she filled in the blanks herself. Marriage, home, children, maybe a little help with Jason's future. She said it like she was planning a vacation, not rewriting my life. She wasn't shy about her expectations. She wanted a daughter-in-law who could provide. Not emotionally, financially. Jason, for all his warmth, didn't see it. Or maybe he did, but didn't know how to fight it. When I brought it up, he looked uncomfortable, rubbed the back of his neck like he was 12 and being scolded for tracking mud through the living room. "She means well," he said. "She just wants to make sure I'm okay." It sounded noble until I realized he didn't mean emotionally. He meant stable, supported, caught. And maybe that's when it clicked for me. That love wasn't always enough. That good men can still be blind, and even the best intentions can come wrapped in strings so tight they choke you. Eleanor wasn't just a mother. She was a strategist. And Jason, whether he knew it or not, was the plan. A good man, modest means, and me. The missing puzzle piece with invisible wealth and a name she wanted printed on Christmas cards. I started seeing the cracks, even in his kindness. The way he'd change his opinion after a phone call with her. The way he'd casually mention things she liked when we talked about the future. The way he never defended me when she crossed a line. Just tried to smooth things over with a tired smile, and a "you know how she is." I did. I knew exactly how she was. And I knew exactly what she saw in me. It didn't come in a dramatic flash of intuition or a whispered warning from some well-meaning friend. It came in the way Eleanor held my wrist one evening, just long enough for her fingers to press too tightly over the veins, and said, with that syrupy grin she always used when she wanted to sound sweet, "Now, dear, let's not forget that marriage is about sharing everything. Jason's always been generous to a fault, and I'm sure you will be too." That was the moment. The exact second I decided the truth would stay buried beneath layers of legal protection and paper-thin smiles, at least until after the vows were signed and filed. I didn't tell Jason about Harlow. Not about the trust. Not about the offshore holdings. Not about the multi-layered structure that made it almost impossible for anyone to trace ownership back to me. I told myself it wasn't lying. It was protection. A shield. Because I could already feel it. The way Eleanor circled me like a vulture that had caught the scent of something ripe. And if she even suspected what I controlled behind my thrift store cardigans and neutral makeup, she'd tear through it with a smile and a planner full of wedding themes. At first, I convinced myself it was just excitement. She offered to help with planning. Brought over binders, actual, physical binders, color-coded and indexed with tabs labeled cake, venue, guest list, floral budget, gown silhouette. I hadn't even picked a date yet. But Eleanor already had a vision, and it looked nothing like mine. "Winter weddings are so drab," she said, flipping past a page of venues. "Spring is much more hopeful. Don't you think lavender and gold would be elegant? Very tasteful, but also luxurious. It's what a teacher and a financier deserve, don't you think?" She always said it like that. A teacher and a financier. As if it were a script she rehearsed when no one was looking. Jason sat beside her, nodding occasionally, not really engaged but not disagreeing either. That's what started to bother me. Not her. She was predictable. It was Jason's silence that started scraping under my skin. Every time she made a ridiculous suggestion, like hiring a designer from out of state for the floral arch, or renting a villa in Napa for the rehearsal dinner, he didn't push back. He didn't say, "That's too much," or "Let's ask Samantha what she wants." He just smiled, looked at me with those kind eyes, and said, "My mom's just trying to help." Then came the first time she mentioned merging accounts. Not with me, never directly, but she said it to Jason over coffee in their kitchen while I was within earshot. You'll want to make sure your finances are aligned after the wedding. No surprises. You don't want to find out she's drowning in student loans or hiding bad credit. It's better to combine everything. It builds trust. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. Jason laughed and said something about trust being the foundation of marriage, and my heart dropped because I could hear it in his voice. He didn't see it. Didn't see how every word she said was calculated, a little test balloon floating in the air, waiting to see if I'd pop it or let it drift. At night, I'd lie in bed beside him, his arm draped around my waist, his breathing slow and content, and I'd stare at the ceiling wondering how someone so kind, so warm, could be so blind. He never pressured me about money, never asked what I made or where it went. But he also never defended me when she pushed, never stopped her when she crossed lines. That silence was louder than any accusation. One afternoon, I came home to find Eleanor sitting on my couch, flipping through a bridal magazine she'd brought herself. She didn't ask to come over. Jason had let her in. She smiled when I walked in, patted the seat next to her, and said, "I was thinking, since you're not using the guest room for anything, we could turn it into a nursery after the wedding. Just something to plan ahead for." There was no engagement ring on my finger yet. No date. No guest list. But Eleanor was already building a future with my real estate. I smiled, tight and professional, and told her it was something Jason and I would talk about. She smiled wider, as if I'd confirmed everything she wanted to hear. Later that night, when I told Jason how invasive that felt, how inappropriate it was, he just shrugged. "She's excited. Maybe a little too much. But it's coming from a good place." I wanted to scream. Instead, I went into the bathroom, locked the door, and stared at myself in the mirror. I looked calm, controlled, but something inside me was splintering, slow and quiet like a hairline fracture in glass. I knew I couldn't tell them. Not yet. Not Eleanor, and not Jason. Not when I couldn't even trust him to say no to lavender table runners. The truth would become leverage. A weapon. A target painted on my back. So I nodded through every brunch. Smiled through every hint. I let her believe I was just another middle-class woman marrying up. Let her think she'd won. And I kept the truth locked up behind firewall after firewall, both digital and emotional. Because if this marriage was going to survive, I had to protect the part of me they would never understand. The part built not from love or romance, but from grit, secrets, and the cold certainty that power, once revealed, is power that can be taken. The wedding was beautiful in that curated, Pinterest board come-to-life way that Eleanor had so obviously engineered down to the angle of the floral arch and the exact moment Jason's voice cracked during his vows. We got married under a pale sky laced with lavender clouds, the kind of backdrop photographers dream of, surrounded by people who smiled a little too tightly and whispered about how perfect everything looked. I wore a dress I didn't pick, carried a bouquet chosen for its symbolism of loyalty, and walked down an aisle flanked by a string quartet that Eleanor insisted on, though I would have preferred silence. It was sincere, Jason's trembling hands, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. But even sincerity can feel choreographed when you realize the director is standing in the back row, pearls tight against her throat, nodding approvingly. We didn't make it to the honeymoon. Barely 12 hours after the final guest had left and the rented crystal had been packed back into velvet-lined boxes, Jason's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He was still half asleep, his voice scratchy as he mumbled into the receiver. "What? Seriously? How bad?" I turned toward him, drowsy and detached, until I heard the phrase that immediately snapped me awake. "Pipe burst in my apartment." That made no sense. Jason hadn't lived in that place in months. We'd already moved most of his stuff into mine. I sat up slowly, watching his face twist in discomfort as he hung up and looked at me with that apologetic smile I'd started to hate. "It's my landlord. Says there's water damage. Wants me to check it out before it gets worse." It sounded rehearsed. Hollow. But I didn't argue. Not then. The city was gray when we arrived, the kind of early morning dullness that felt like it belonged to funerals or forgotten Mondays. I expected damp air, maybe the smell of mold or wet wood. What I got was silence. No dripping, no maintenance crew, no landlord waiting to unlock the door. Just Eleanor's car parked too perfectly by the curb. Jason didn't react. He just walked up and opened the door like he already knew. Inside, it was quiet. Too quiet. Eleanor was sitting on the edge of the old velvet armchair Jason never got rid of. Beside her stood a man in a dark suit, lean and polished, his briefcase already open on the coffee table. Another man, older, with sharp eyes and a seal-stamped folder, stood behind them holding a clipboard. Eleanor smiled when she saw us. Not warm, not welcoming, just pleased. "Oh, good. You made it," she said, rising slowly, smoothing down her skirt like we were late to an appointment no one had told me about. We were just about to go over the details. Jason blinked, clearly rattled. "What's going on?" "No leaks," I said. My voice was flat, cold, just paperwork. Eleanor didn't flinch. She gestured toward the coffee table, where the man in the suit was already sliding pages into neat alignment. "This is Mr. Carmichael, our family lawyer, and Mr. Price, the notary. We just need a few signatures to formalize things now that you're legally one." I didn't sit down. Jason looked between us, confusion etched into every line of his face. "Sign what?" Eleanor beamed like this was the part she had been waiting for. "The company, dear. Samantha's stake in Harlow. 50% to be exact. To be placed in a marital trust for the family. A real married couple shares everything, don't they?" There was a long, sharp silence. Mr. Carmichael cleared his throat and slid the first document toward me, pointing out the signature line with a practiced finger. "It's standard procedure for high-value assets. Protects both parties. Ensures mutual benefit." I stared at the paper. My name, typed in bold next to a line of legalese. Jason's name below mine. The word irrevocable jumped out like a bruise. I didn't move. Eleanor's smile tightened. "Of course, it's only fair. Jason's given you everything. His heart, his name, his future. You've said your vows. This is just a formality." I turned to Jason. His expression was pure confusion, verging on something more helpless. "You knew about this?" He shook his head quickly. "No. This isn't what Mom, this is." But Eleanor wasn't even looking at him anymore. She was watching me, studying me. "Samantha, you come from a world of money. You know how these things work. It's not about greed. It's about unity. About building a future together." I stepped back. Just one step. But it felt like a chasm opened between us. "No," I said. Jason blinked. "What?" I said no. My voice didn't waver. "Not once. I'm not signing." Mr. Carmichael glanced at Eleanor. The notary shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor didn't move. Her face didn't change. But her eyes, those sharp little instruments of control, narrowed, just enough to show the first crack in the performance. "You don't mean that," she said. "You're upset. It's been a long weekend. This is the responsible thing to do." I looked straight at her. "This is a trap. And I see it now. All of it." Jason reached out, but I stepped away. Not because I hated him. Not because I stopped loving him. But because love is not a blindfold. And I refuse to let it be a leash. "No one gets Harlow," I said, staring down at the document one last time. "Not through deception. Not through pressure. And definitely not through you." Then I turned, walked out the door, and didn't look back. Not even when Jason called my name. He followed me into the hallway, barefoot, still in the shirt he wore at our wedding dinner, the collar wilted now, face flushed with a panic that came too late. "Samantha, wait. Please, just listen to me." I stopped, halfway to the stairwell, the hem of my dress catching against the doorframe like it didn't want to leave either. I turned slowly, holding his gaze like it was a weapon I hadn't yet decided whether to use. "Did you know?" His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "No," he said. "I swear. I had no idea they'd be there. The lawyer, the notary. I thought we were checking on the plumbing." His voice cracked, weak around the edges, and I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But then I saw it, the flicker of guilt he couldn't quite hide. "But you talked to her," I said. "You talked to Eleanor about my finances." He didn't answer right away. That pause, half a second too long, was all I needed. I stepped back again. "Jason." His shoulders sagged. "I didn't think she'd do something like this. We were talking, just talking, about maybe down the line, combining things. Like most married couples do. I didn't even know about Harlow back then, I swear." It hit like a slap. I stared at him. This man I'd once seen as gentle, warm, naive in a way that made me want to protect him, and realized I'd been protecting the wrong person. Myself. I'd spent so long guarding my truth, hiding it behind paper walls and encrypted files, and yet somehow, Eleanor had still sniffed out the scent of money like blood in water. And Jason, whether he meant to or not, had handed her the map. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just reached down, twisted the wedding ring from my finger, and placed it in his hand with a calmness that felt more like frost than resolve. "You should have told me," I said, the moment the conversation started. "You should have told me what she was planning." "She didn't tell me," he tried. "Samantha, please. I'm not part of this." "Yes," I said, voice low. You are. Maybe not the architect, but the door was open because of you. Then I walked out. Katie opened the door before I could knock a second time. She didn't say anything at first, just pulled me into a hug that I didn't realize I needed until her arms wrapped around my spine, and I felt something finally crack open. She didn't ask questions, didn't prod, just poured me a glass of red wine and handed me a pair of her boyfriend's sweatpants like it was any other sleepover. The next morning, I called Frank. Frank was the kind of lawyer you never introduced at parties. Not because he wasn't polite. He was, but because he had the disarming talent of knowing exactly what you were thinking and laying it out like a surgical tool on a stainless steel table. He'd been with me since my grandfather's will was first unsealed, and if there was anyone on earth who understood exactly how deep the Harlow protections ran, it was him. He picked up on the first ring. "Frank," I said, and my voice was tired, scratchy, raw from a night of silence and self-restraint. "I need you to check something for me. Eleanor tried to ambush me yesterday. Lawyer, notary, papers. She wanted Jason to take 50% of the company." He was silent for a moment. Then, "Did you sign anything?" "No." "Good," he said. The sound of keys tapping came through the line. "Then you're fine. The structure's intact. The board remains untouched. All voting rights stay with you. The shares are still held through the offshore trust, and the ownership records are locked under NDA. There's nothing they could have accessed without your signature." I exhaled for the first time in what felt like 12 hours. But then he added, "What she did, what they tried, that borders on civil fraud. Possibly coercion. If they had succeeded, we'd be dealing with grounds for criminal litigation. You need to understand how serious that was, Samantha." "I do," I said. And I did. Fully, viscerally. "They were hoping you'd be emotional," he continued, voice cold now, clinical. "That you'd be tired, sentimental, vulnerable after the wedding. That you'd see a signature as part of the commitment." I pictured Eleanor's smile. The practiced warmth. The timing. The setup. They hadn't been hoping. They'd been planning. Frank paused. "Do you want to press charges?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know, but because, for the first time in years, I realized how alone I really was in this. Alone in my wealth. In my caution. In the fortress I'd built to keep people out, and the silence it left behind. "No," I said quietly. "Not yet." But I didn't say never. I sat across from Frank in his office. A space that smelled like leather and expensive silence, staring at the folder in front of me like it might contain the answer to a question I hadn't yet figured out how to ask. I hadn't worn my ring since I'd dropped it in Jason's palm like a dead weight, and my left hand felt naked now, too light, like something had been scraped off me. Frank had outlined the options clinically: annulment for fraud, divorce with cause, or a conversation. The last one sounded the most naive, but also the most final in its own way. Because once I heard the truth, there'd be no room left for doubt or excuses. I chose the meeting. It wasn't about giving Jason a second chance. It was about dragging everything into the light, stripping away the velvet curtains and wedding lace and showing the raw, bleeding thing underneath. I told Frank to make it formal. No surprise visits. No more hallway confessions. An official sit-down. Controlled. Contained. Documented. They arrived exactly on time. Jason in the same blue blazer he'd worn on our first date, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Eleanor in her favorite pearl earrings, spine straight as ever, as if she were stepping into a courtroom instead of a trap she had set herself. Frank greeted them with the same flat professionalism he reserved for clients and adversaries alike. We sat in silence until the door clicked shut behind his assistant and the conference room settled into a dense, suffocating quiet. "I want the truth," I said, no preamble. "Everything. All of it. Or we walk out of here with paperwork instead of answers." Jason looked at Eleanor, then at me. "I told you I didn't know. This isn't for you to defend." I cut in. "This is for her." Eleanor didn't blink. "I've already explained. It was a simple miscalculation." Frank opened the folder. The first page was a property assessment. The second, a credit report. The third, a lien notice. And it kept going: medical bills, credit card statements, loan agreements, education debt co-signed by Jason and guaranteed by Eleanor. And finally, the paperwork for a second mortgage on the home she so proudly claimed as her sanctuary. It was surgical, precise, every line a needle. Frank didn't look up as he flipped through each document. We traced all financial activity linked to Eleanor Hutchinson over the last 4 years. The picture is clear. There's a combined debt of approximately $176,000, spread across healthcare, personal credit, educational financing, and home equity. Bankruptcy proceedings were started twice and halted due to pending negotiations with private lenders. Jason's face turned gray. Eleanor said nothing. Frank slid the folder toward her. "You saw a lifeline in Samantha. Not a daughter-in-law. Not a partner for your son. Just a number. A balance sheet fix. Still, she said nothing. I leaned forward, voice low and steady. You never saw me. Not really. Just a solution. A calculation. You thought I'd be so charmed by Jason I wouldn't notice you setting a fire in the background. Eleanor's mouth tightened. You have resources, more than you need. What's mine is his, and what's his is yours. That's what marriage is. That's how families work. I stared at her, the audacity of it landing heavier than any confession. Families work with honesty. With trust. Not manipulation. Jason finally found his voice. Mom, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you say it was this bad? Her eyes snapped to him. What would you have done, Jason? Taken on the debt yourself? Married someone else? You think love keeps the lights on? There it was. The core of her logic. The rot at the root. Frank closed the folder. This, in legal terms, is financial coercion. Attempted fraud. If we were to press charges, the evidence is admissible. The timeline is traceable. You planned this, Eleanor. Down to the moment of emotional leverage. I stood up. Jason didn't follow. Eleanor turned back to me, and for the first time, there was no performance left in her eyes. Just something hollow. Not regret. She wasn't capable of that, but maybe the realization that her plan had failed, and that failure was the one thing she didn't know how to explain. I looked at Jason one last time, but whatever had been between us was already dead. Not because of the debt, but because when it counted, when it really counted, he didn't stop her. I didn't need a court or a decree. I already had my answer. The night after the meeting, I sat in Katie's guest room, my laptop open, legal pads scattered across the bed like old battle plans. I hadn't spoken to Jason since we left Frank's office. He tried texting twice, short, cautious messages that read more like apologies from someone watching a fragile structure collapse in slow motion. But I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I couldn't trust anything unsaid anymore. Words had to be recorded now. Witnessed. Signed. When I finally agreed to meet, it was in daylight, in Frank's office again, with every chair exactly as it had been the last time. I told Jason to come alone. He did. He looked worse. Paler, thinner. Like the weight of all his mother's decisions had finally settled into his spine. He sat across from me, didn't reach for my hand, didn't speak until I gave him permission. That mattered. I need to say something first. I told him, voice firm but not cruel. This isn't about punishment. It's about structure. Because right now, the foundation is gone. And if there's anything left between us worth saving, it starts with rebuilding, completely. He nodded, didn't interrupt. So I laid it out. 3 months apart. Separate homes. No shared finances. No shared accounts. You'll move out tomorrow. Frank has the lease agreements already prepared. We'll each cover our own expenses. No exceptions. Second, you'll sign a post-marital contract. One that reaffirms that all premarital and future business assets remain solely mine. No claims. No access. No disputes. Third, we start couples therapy. Weekly. Non-negotiable. And last, your mother is cut off. Completely. She will have no involvement, no input, no visibility into our finances, our home, or our decisions. Ever again. Jason sat very still. His mouth twitched like he wanted to protest. But he didn't. Instead, he said, okay, I'll do all of it. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just nodded. Then we try. Eleanor was next. That conversation didn't happen in person. Frank handled it, blunt, direct, clinical. He sent her the documents, a clean, clear waiver of any potential future claim to my assets or estate. No loopholes. No contingencies. When she signed them and returned them by courier, 2 days early, he called to confirm. She didn't flinch, he said. Didn't ask questions. Just signed. Then the news came. She had started therapy. Katie told me, with a raised eyebrow and a kind of amused disbelief. Apparently she's seeing Dr. Haddock. Real guy. Licensed. Not a life coach with a blog. She'd also filed paperwork with a credit rehab agency. Entered into a payment plan with one of her creditors. Started liquidating jewelry. Some of it real, some of it costume. It didn't change the past. But it was something. 3 weeks into the separation, Jason sent a picture. Just a photo of a ring box on a coffee table, unopened. Still here, the message said. Not moving without you. I didn't answer. Not yet. I needed more than gestures. I needed permanence. Agreements. Boundaries written in ink. But for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel hunted. I felt heard. The first session was awkward in that brittle, polite way where both of us kept trying to guess what the other was willing to admit out loud. The therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Danielle with notebook-creased jeans and eyes like sonar, sat quietly, watching as I crossed my arms and Jason kept his hands clenched in his lap. No one yelled. No one cried. That came later. The first day was just silence and the sound of 2 people learning how to tell the truth in front of a witness. Living apart wasn't the punishment I thought it would be. It became a refuge. I could breathe in my space again. No ghost of Eleanor's perfume on the hallway towels. No anxious glances from Jason every time I opened my laptop. I went back to my morning routines. Coffee alone, news before emails, evening walks with noise-canceling headphones. And still, I showed up every week. So did he. Jason did more than I asked. I think that mattered. He started with therapy, then enrolled in a financial planning course. He sent me the syllabus without prompting. I need to understand your world, he said. Not just the numbers. The structure. What you're carrying. I didn't reply, but I saved the message. Then, one afternoon, Frank called. Jason just submitted his employment paperwork, he said, the barest hint of surprise in his voice. Entry-level operations. Harlow Technologies. He didn't ask me for the job. He didn't even tell me he was applying. For the first month, he worked quietly, processing backlog logistics, reviewing procedural documentation, attending cross-departmental briefings like any new hire. He clocked in, clocked out, said nothing to the staff about our relationship. No special treatment. No name-dropping. He didn't even mention my name to HR until they found the shared surname on a payroll form and asked if it was a typo. I wanted to learn it. He told me one night after therapy, when we were walking separately to our cars. Not inherit it. Learn what it meant to you. Why you protected it. I stopped walking. He kept his eyes ahead. It's not just a company, is it? It's a record. A memory. Your grandfather's fingerprint on the world. You don't just manage it, you defend it. And for the first time in a long time, I believed he understood. Because Harlow wasn't a bank account. It wasn't even about wealth. It was about vigilance. About legacy. About a man who built something with his hands and taught me how to keep it standing long after he was gone. About layers of protection crafted not just to safeguard money, but meaning. Jason didn't ask for access again. He didn't ask to be added to any list. He just kept showing up, every morning at 7:45 sharp, coffee in hand, ID badge clipped, prepared. He became quiet in the right ways. Our therapist once asked him what he learned about me that surprised him. He said, I thought she was protecting money. But she was protecting people, dead ones, living ones, maybe even future ones. I didn't see that before. I just saw numbers. That was the week I invited him to dinner. Not at a restaurant. Not in public. My apartment. My space. He brought nothing but himself. Didn't ask where the wine glasses were. Didn't ask if we were back together. He just sat across from me, listened when I talked, and said, whatever comes next, I'm staying in the work. I believed him. Not because he promised, but because for the first time, he didn't expect anything in return. It started with an envelope. No return address, no unnecessary flourish. Just my name, printed in her familiar cursive, and a simple note paperclipped to the top of a typed page. I would appreciate your time, if and only if you feel safe doing so. I'm working on being better at asking instead of assuming. Beneath the note was a financial statement. Every credit card, every outstanding balance, every monthly payment she was now making on time. No theatrics, no excuses. Just math. The kind of math that used to be my territory. I didn't respond, but I didn't throw it away either. Then came the next letter. This one shorter, handwritten. If you're open to it, I'd like to apologize in person. I've learned that owning your behavior isn't about defending it. I showed it to Frank. He read it twice, then said, she's either working overtime on her image or something shifted. 3 days later, she sent an email, not to me, but to Frank, asking if it was appropriate to request a short meeting. She requested permission to speak to both of us. Didn't demand. Didn't assume. I agreed, with caution. She arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the waiting room until Frank's assistant called her in. She wore no pearls, no heavy perfume. Just a navy blouse, plain slacks, and a look I couldn't quite recognize. Not contrite. Not pitiful. Just stripped down. She sat, looked at me, then said, I have something to say. I've practiced it. But I also understand that practice doesn't make pain disappear. I waited. She took a breath. What I did wasn't care. It wasn't maternal instinct. It wasn't concern. It was manipulation. I used the language of family to try to climb out of a hole I dug with bad choices and worse pride. The room was still. She went on, calmly, as if this wasn't the first time she'd said it. I thought control would keep me safe. I thought money, access to it, proximity to it, was a cure for fear. I built my entire adult life on that illusion. And then I met someone who saw through it. And I tried to break her instead of listening. No excuses. No tears. Just the truth. She reached into her bag, pulled out a folder, and slid it across the table. Inside were forms, waivers of claim, revised power of attorney documents, signed letters of withdrawal from any future estate claims. All notarized. I'm working with Dr. Haddock, she added. I see her twice a week. We're digging deep. Control issues, financial dependency, relational boundaries. I've started sending my own reports to Jason every month. He doesn't ask for them, but I do it anyway. Because accountability isn't about what people want. It's about what they deserve. I sat there, unsure how to move. Because I'd spent so long preparing for battle, I didn't know what to do when the enemy laid down her weapons and asked for nothing in return. I don't want access, Eleanor said quietly. I don't want forgiveness. I want space to keep changing. Then she stood, smoothed her shirt. Thank you for listening, she said. I'll wait to be invited next time. She walked out. And for the first time since that terrible afternoon in Jason's apartment, I didn't feel like she was walking toward an angle. She was just walking away, alone, and letting that be enough. 6 months after the wedding, we moved back in together. Not with a grand gesture or a bottle of champagne, but with 3 labeled boxes, a carefully revised cohabitation agreement, and a signed post-nuptial contract that sat, notarized, in a fireproof safe. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. There were no confetti-strewn reunions or Instagram-worthy key exchanges. But it was honest, controlled, mutually agreed upon. And after everything, that mattered more than flowers ever could. The apartment looked the same, but everything felt different. Jason didn't ask to merge bank accounts. He didn't flinch when I locked the home office behind me every night. He brewed coffee in the mornings and waited for an invitation to join me at the table, not because he was afraid, but because he respected the shape of the space now. And I let him in, slowly, intentionally, in the places where it counted. The prenuptial agreement, delayed, debated, and finally signed, stood like quiet armor around the company. Harlow remained entirely mine. Shares, governance, voting rights, intellectual property protections. Frank reviewed every line twice, and Jason never asked to skip a clause. He just signed where I asked him to, not because he didn't care, but because he finally understood why the boundaries were there. I offered him a formal position at Harlow 2 weeks later, Director of Educational Programs. He hesitated at first, said he didn't want it if it was charity or guilt. I told him it wasn't. It was recognition of his growth, of his understanding, and of his value in a department that needed more than code and risk models. It needed heart, empathy, perspective, the kind of insight only someone like him, someone who'd stood on both sides of control, could bring. He took the job. Eleanor stayed quiet, just like she promised. She sent quarterly financial updates to Frank, not me. She checked in with Jason through carefully timed calls, never unannounced. When she asked to visit for dinner, she did it through email, subject line. Request for family time, no assumptions. It felt clinical at first. Then it felt safe. Therapy continued. So did the work. Not because anything was broken anymore, but because we learned not to wait for cracks to show before checking the foundation. There were moments, still, when the past buzzed in the background like static. A quiet voice asking if the piece was real. But the voice was quieter now. Because the walls weren't made of illusion anymore. They were made of signed agreements. Documented decisions. Conversations that took days instead of seconds. And most of all, respect. Built brick by brick through silence, restraint, and the knowledge that trust isn't built in promises. It's built in behavior. And none of it, would have been possible if I'd opened my mouth too soon. If I had told them about the $25.6 million before I understood their intentions. Before Jason understood his own. Before Eleanor was ready to admit that love without boundaries is just control in disguise. The truth came later. When it was safe. When it was earned. When it could be seen as legacy instead of opportunity. And because of that silence, measured, precise, necessary, we're still standing. Now I'm curious, what would you have done in my place? Would you have revealed the truth early on? Do you think trust is ever fully reparable after betrayal, or is it just about managing the damage? I'd love to hear your thoughts, your stories, your reactions. Because I know I can't be the only one who's ever had to choose between love and legacy. So, what would you have chosen?